Hi, welcome to Chamber Chats. I'm Bruce Williams, CEO of the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce. I'd like to begin, as always, by acknowledging that I live and work on the ancestral territories of the Lekwungen-speaking Coast Salish nations, in particular the nations of the Songhees and the Esquimalt. Our Chamber Chats are brought to you by Island Savings, a division of First West Credit Union, and by our friends at C-SPAN. We're doing this from the podcasting studio at Czech Television. I want to talk about something that you see and you hear about and you read about every day, and in some cases you may walk or drive past it and see it. Those are the people who are, as the term goes, living rough. They're living in tents. They're living in hotels. And a guy who knows all about that is my guest today. Julian Daly is the CEO of the Our Place Society. Julian, hi. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, good afternoon, Bruce.
So again, we see these people in whatever media we might be consuming or see them in person, and I want to have a really basic and fundamental conversation with you, Julian. Who are these people?
Who are these people? They're people's brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers, people's family. They, first and foremost, they're people. I think sometimes that may sound like a very obvious thing to say, but often they're very dehumanized in society and sometimes in the media even, and demonized as well. But they are people who had a tough life in one way or another and have fallen on tough times, and they are folk that have not been able to come back from that for whatever reason. Many, if not all, had early childhood trauma, childhoods of neglect, abuse, which led to mental health and addiction challenges in adulthood. Some are people who are, working in jobs and lost their jobs. People end up homeless because of divorces, end up homeless because they had injuries at work and started taking OxyContin, for example. That's a very common route to homelessness. So people become homeless and come to our place through all sorts of routes, really. But first and foremost, they're our fellow human beings and our fellow citizens, and I think that's something that is worth restating.
I think when you stop and consider the number of people, for example, in their day-to-day lives who live paycheck to paycheck or hand to mouth, who don't have the ability, with the cost of living here and other things, to save up for a little contingency or a rainy day fund, that's a very real thing all the time.
Yeah, and we've seen that especially this year, where a number of people who were just getting by lost their jobs in Victoria, in Greater Victoria, and are now coming to our place for services, who never would have ever thought they'd come to our place or need our services, and also people who are homeless for the first time in their lives because they simply can't meet those rents.
Another thing that is kind of part of that whole culture, both on those who are directly involved with it and those who are on the outside of it, there's kind of an unknown factor. There's a lot of fear, is there not? People are afraid. People who are not part of that group are afraid of who they are and what they might be. And the people themselves that are affected by the homelessness issue, they themselves are afraid.
Yeah, it's very true. There's a lot of fear. And I understand why people might feel fearful, because many of the homeless folk that people see, can look disheveled. They sometimes haven't washed for days or had clean clothes through no fault of their own, just simple lack of access to clean clothes or to washing facilities. Sometimes people have mental health challenges, which can make people seem quite frightening. Sometimes people are openly using drugs on the streets too, because they don't have a home to use them in, which is what most people who use drugs in our cities have, homes to use them in. Mm-hmm. So all of that can come together to be quite frightening. But the reality is somewhat different in that in my 12 years of working with homeless folk, I've actually not known of any incident around anywhere I've worked of a homeless person attacking physically someone from outside of the homeless community. But I know that there's a perceived fear there, absolutely, and that's very real for people. There is fear also within the community, as you say, Bruce, and that's much more realistic. Something that many people don't know is that homeless people are disproportionately affected by crime.
Mhm.
that homeless folk often suffer severe violence and abuse, women's sexual abuse, particularly within the community. That can happen. So, yeah, the people are fearful when they're on the street. They're more frightened of folk who are outside the homeless community than people might realize.
The term homeless is one too that we've used for a long time. The unhoused is another way to put it, because
Yeah.
that's a literal sense. But you and I are in a couple of committees together, and we talk about this on a regular basis. And I've always been a really big believer in really basic, forthright, straight
Yeah.
ahead language. So when you say that these are people that are fathers, daughters, sons, aunts, uncles, cousins, what's the answer to the question, well, where's their family and why aren't they helping them?
Often people are estranged from their families. It's very typical for homeless folk to have lost their kids to the child welfare system, often when they're very young, and it becomes almost impossible to get them back. If you don't have a home, you can't get your kids back. Even if you're actually mentally and in a good spot, you can't get your kids back. So there's people are estranged from families for those reasons. Often, because of mental health and addictions, people have lost their partners, their family. Sometimes families, just can't take any more. In my experience, people's families are pretty much try to stick by them, but sometimes the behaviors and the lives that people lead is too distressing and too difficult and for families, and they kind of let go. And sometimes there's violence driving the estrangement as well. So there's a whole series of reasons why people are not connected to their families anymore. And sometimes families are ashamed of the people who've become homeless in their family, and they don't really want them around. And and sometimes too, the homeless people are very ashamed. That actually drives it more than anything. People don't want their children or their sister or their brother or their parents to see the state they're in. They're very aware of what they're in, and it's embarrassing and shameful. So there's a lot of reasons why people are estranged from their families. It's complicated, and every story is somewhat different.
I want to bring COVID into the conversation here. We're speaking today on Chamber Chats with Julian Daly, the CEO of the Our Place Society. Many of these people were in the circumstance they find themselves in now before COVID, but COVID came along and then changed the whole dynamic of housing these people and taking care of them and providing support. So let's talk about that for a second, Julian, because part of what I think I understand is that many of these people would normally be housed in a shelter, but because of COVID protocols, they can't be. Is that accurate?
Yeah, shelter spaces have been halved effectively because of COVID and the requirements of physical distancing. So that's meant there's a lot less spaces. Also, some providers are no longer providing shelter space this year because of COVID and the risks to other residents and their staff. So there's been a great reduction. Also, the fact that the city has allowed, because of the provincial health orders, people to camp 24/7. That's also meant that people have established sort of semi-permanent camping situations, whereas previously people could only camp from 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning, and then had to remove their tents.
So in a way, COVID has put this whole circumstance front and center. Boom, there it is, in your face. Stuff that organizations like yours and the Salvation Army and others were able to manage pre-COVID in a certain fashion. That's now just in the open public.
Yeah, absolutely.
Media, right?
I think it was hidden in all sorts of ways, and COVID has exposed that very vividly. I think it's not created it,
No.
and I don't subscribe to the view that Victoria has been kind of overwhelmed and awash with people from outside of Victoria coming here, because the services that we offer here are no better, I don't think. In fact, fewer than many other Canadian cities. So I don't buy that. I think it's simply that we're seeing the people who were previously invisible now because of COVID, because they can camp, and because there isn't enough space in shelters, both day shelters and night shelters for people. So they're out on the streets and they're in our parks.
For a long time, again, pre-COVID, you, your staff, the workers in your agency, and many others are the ones that are doing this remarkable, selfless work to take care of these people. Your folks, your staff, have had to, the word of the year, pivot into a whole new means of doing what they do. Tell me about the impact and change that's had on your day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month operation, and how your staff people manage this.
Yeah, they've been remarkable, actually. I wrote to all the staff just before Christmas saying how proud I was to work here and to work alongside them, because every single member of our staff has turned up to work every day. Every single one has turned up to work every day throughout this, which is remarkable, because I know there are organizations doing very similar work in our country, in our city, but also in other cities that I'm aware of, where that simply did not happen. And I'm not standing in judgment of those people. I understand people's feeling why they didn't turn up to work, but I'm so proud of my colleagues that they have, and I think it's because they know that our place is the only place for some people to come every day. It is the only place for some people to find 3 meals a day and showers, and to have the comfort of some coffee and snacks, and a place that's warm and safe inside. And that if we weren't providing that, those folk would have nowhere to go. And COVID's been frightening for homeless people just as much as non-homeless folk. So it's so important for us to continue to provide that refuge and a place of hope and belonging for people in these very difficult times. So I think that's why my colleagues wanted to keep coming to work, to ensure that we could keep doing that, because that's why they got into the work in the first place. So COVID wasn't going to stop them.
I've been saying for many years that by we I mean those of us in the general population, we delegate that work to you. We delegate that work to organizations like yours and your supporters and your staff and the people who volunteer and the people who give you money and invest in what you're doing. The question I like to bring up sometimes, and I'll bring it up with you right now, what would be happening if you weren't there? If Our Place and Salvation Army and Umbrella Society and people like that were not there doing what you do every day, then what would it look like?
I think you would notice a significant escalation in the despair amongst people who would have nowhere to go day to day, nowhere to. It's not just about going for meals, but a place that feels like a community where you belong. A place where you can get a bit of hope, because sometimes the lives of the folk that we serve can feel very hopeless. I mean, we all experience hopelessness, but most of us lucky enough to have jobs and homes and social networks. Imagine if you didn't really have any social network, you're estranged from your family, you have no work, you have no home. That's a pretty bleak place. So if there was no place to call home during the day and night, which I think places like Our Place and Salvation Army and others do provide people, that would, I think, lead to an escalation in already deteriorated mental health. Probably people would despair to the point of taking their lives, I would imagine, if there was nowhere to go and no one to welcome them and greet them and make them feel visible. So there would be that. I also think you'd probably see an escalation in crime. Because some people get by just because we feed 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, and they can get basic needs met here. If we didn't do that, and others didn't do it, they'd have to steal to get that food. It's as simple as that. I mean, human beings will do whatever we can to feed ourselves. It's human nature. So I think that you'd probably see an escalation in crime. You'd also see a lot of people who have mental health challenges and really quite unwell out on the streets, wandering the streets, which would be obviously a further distress to them, but also distressing and difficult for others to witness as well, because most citizens find that quite frightening, going back to your earlier point, but also feel that there's nothing they can do. So those are just some of the things that immediately come to mind, that if there wasn't places like Our Place and Salvation Army and others, I think we'd see we'd see more social disorder. I think we'd see more public manifestations of mental health challenges. I think we'd see more despair, frankly, amongst people who are already having a pretty tough life of it.
When you talk about it also being a place where they can find a sense of community, that kind of accounts for the name. The name of it is Our Place. Our Place is not for everybody in community wide. It's for those individuals who call that their community. That's their place. They're saying, this is our place. And that's part of the healing of all that too. You brought up the question of policing, and I want to move along with that topic next. We're speaking with Julian Daly. He's the CEO of the Our Place Society. Julian, you and I have had this conversation about how what goes on in these facilities and on the street is interpreted by various levels of media, with all due respect to all of them. There seems to be a large concentration on the crime and the violence, and less attention to the fact that at its core, this is a housing and a mental health issue. Full stop. That's at the beginning of all this. That's at the core. So where do the police fit into what happens day to day with your organization and the others doing what you do?
Yeah, we put great store by having a good relationship with the police, from the very top down to the beats on the street. And we work hand in hand with them, because it's odd. We also seek to protect and serve the people that come through our door. So we work with the police on that, and the police indeed do as well. I know the police have sometimes had a bad reputation for their work with homeless people, but you know what? The majority of the police interactions I've seen with homeless people have been very respectful and kind, and actually I've seen great police work in keeping homeless people who can be very vulnerable, keeping them safe. I think the police have an important role to play in keeping homeless people safe as well. In terms of the crime, I think some of the crime that happens in our city is may well be carried out by people who are homeless. It's not clear to me, but I wouldn't be surprised, because there's a range of people doing crimes. But I don't think that anything like what is attributed to homeless people is carried out by them. For example, last year near the Comfort Inn, when there was a break-in to the Dodds Furniture Warehouse, it was blamed on essentially homeless people. And then it turned out, and this is from the police, that it was two known criminals from Vancouver who'd come over and had done it. And it wasn't homeless people at all. So I think sometimes some of this happens under the guise of homeless encampments or homeless hotels and homeless serving organizations. My experience with homeless folk and crimes is that a lot of the crimes, and they're often of violence, are within the homeless community. The crimes outside tend to be pretty petty in nature. That doesn't mean that they're no less serious, but I think that's also something to be seen. Recently downtown Victoria, there's been a whole spate of robberies.
Right.
And I think some people kind of thought maybe that's homeless people doing it, but the robberies were incredibly sophisticated. People with glass cutting things and suction pads and all sorts. Homeless folk don't carry around that kind of gear. That's just not the MO of homeless folk. So again, that would be an example of not properly attributing crime. It was, something you've talked about a lot, Bruce, and you and I talked about is mental health and addictions, and that's another area where the police, they say themselves, they're not social workers. No. That shouldn't. Such a high percentage of their work is taken up with people who are basically mentally ill and who have severe or chronic addictions. And that's what we need to tackle. And that's why many people are homeless. If you examine the root cause of most people's homelessness, it is either mental health challenges or addiction or a combination of both.
Because they're kind of the same.
Which means they can't get housing for all sorts of reasons, because they can't get income, they can't get housing, or no landlord will take them in. Or when they do get housing, they can't maintain it because their lives are so chaotic because of the mental health and the addictions, and they bring people into their apartments, and there's parties, and they lose their housing rapidly. It's very common for people who are homeless with mental health and addictions to lose their housing again and again and again. And yet we do nothing to not much to address the mental health and addictions, which is the thing that's driving the homelessness and keeping people from sustaining housing as well. And it just seems a bit crazy, excuse the pun, to not go to the source of the problem, the systemic issues.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's also been proven that among this large group of people, the ones who cause all the problems, the 911 incidences, are a very small group of them. It's a handful of people that are making all of that stuff happen. We're going to wrap it up here, Julian. We're just about out of time. I want to talk about next steps. So we're speaking with Julian Daly, the CEO of Our Place Society. The province has announced that they're going to create 5 pilot mental health treatment and addiction facilities across the province, which is a start. But facilities for the people who want treatment, which is most of them, are a very important next step. So what does that look like, and what does housing look like going forward?
I think we need a continuum of treatment. They need to be connected. So both mental health and addiction. So community-based, light touch mental health, institutional-based, voluntary mental health services. And then I think we also need to look at having involuntary mental health services as well for those that are so ill and that they can't even recognize how ill they are, but they're a danger to themselves more than anyone and are very vulnerable, that they be able to be put in a safe place till they stabilize. So there's a kind of a range of mental health services. Same with treatment. We need own detox, we need treatment, we need recovery housing once people have finished treatment so they can maintain their sobriety. Right. And again, a range of housing, everything from the totally independent through to the highly supported, because some people will never maintain their housing without some support, and some can maintain it with no support, and there's everything in between. And we've tended to have a bit of a one size fits all in terms of addictions, mental health, and housing. And actually, you need something much more nuanced and more tailor-made for individuals, because none of us really fit a one-size-fits-all. So why would homeless folk or people with mental health and addiction? So I think we need to be a lot more nuanced and create more continuums, and see how also we have to see how the housing, treatment, and mental health continuums overlap and interconnect as well, because they're inextricably linked. That's another thing that we haven't always done. We haven't seen those connections. So we need to do more of that, I think.
Julian, we're going to call it there, but we will catch up on this again later. Thank you for all the work that you do and your staff and everyone. So, folks, remember that you can support these organizations to do what they do. So the Our Place website is a place to go for that. To say this webcast again, this vodcast and others, you can go to the Check TV website or victoriachamber.ca. Thanks again to our sponsors at Island Savings Credit Union and C-SPAN. Thanks to the folks at Check TV for hosting us here today. I'm Bruce Williams, and we'll see you for another Chamber Chat.